Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of our Elkhart County history video series. Today's topic is the fur trade that took place between our native groups that lived in this area and European and American groups. So it was a really important topic of how all these cultures came together. So what we're going to talk about today is what they were trading, why it was important for all these groups, and what was the impact, not just on each group, but also on the environment. So there's a lot to explore here today. So let's head on into our exhibit and let's talk about what was the fur trade and what they were trading. All right, so now we've moved into our exhibit, and as you can see in front of me, we have various items that would have been used during the fur trade when the Europeans arrived here. Now, I want to first off say that native groups were trading for hundreds of years here in North America, even before the European groups got here. They were trading with other native groups across the region and really across what today is the United States and North America. They were getting items from all over the place through a very long channel of different groups trading back and forth. So native groups here in Elkhart County could have gotten things all the way from Florida, let's say. And we have some proof of that, some of the things we have in our collection. But when the Europeans arrived, when they injected themselves into this trade network, they brought a whole bunch of new products that really changed the way native groups lived here in this area. And I have some here as an example. Probably one of the biggest things that they brought were tools that were made out of metal. So in a previous video, we were talking about tools made out of stone and things like that. But now European groups were bringing things like metal axes or pots and pans made out of metal, or you can see here with this Dutch oven. This really changed the way native groups function because with more and more trading metal items entering into the trade network, less and less stone tools are made. And if you think about it, it makes sense. Because would you rather cook with a pot made out of metal or natural resources? A metal pot's going to stay warm longer, it's going to heat up faster, it's really going to help you and improve cooking and cleaning and all the things you needed a pot for. So metal goods were a really important thing, and metal tools are a really important thing that were introduced. Things like blankets. You can see here we have a brown wool blanket. There are a number of other different blankets and things made out of fabric, different clothing items, all those different things. So as European groups injected things made out of felt or fabric or cotton or wool, you see native groups, the way they dressed and their clothing start to change as well. And of course, probably the biggest thing were firearms, guns. Guns and bullets really changed the way native groups hunted and defended themselves. And those who traded with European groups that were getting firearms against those who didn't really were at a disadvantage. So these are just a few examples of the things that European groups brought to the fur trade. In return, as you can see here, the native groups were bringing these native animals to the fur trade and trading for these other items. So you can see here we have an example of some of the items, some of the animals and furs that were traded here in this region of our country, whether it's a fox or a raccoon or a woodchuck or even a mink. These animals were trapped by native groups, and as European traders would come to their villages, they would trade back and forth. So sometimes when we get children in here for field trips, they ask the question, why didn't they just use money? Well, currency was not something that they were trading, because if you think about it here in North America, if you were a Potawatomi or a Miami Native American living in this area, were you needing French money or British money or American money? What are you going to do with it? They didn't have any use for it. So it was much more important for them to trade and barter for things that they could use and things that they needed. And with that being said, these acted like money, and each of these has a different value. When we talk about beavers later on in the video, we're going to talk about all these different values. But think of these things just like currency. Each one can be more or less valuable than the other, and that's going to drive up the price. Like, say for example, a French fur trader really needed a fox fur. They might be willing to give that native person that they're trading with more items than they would normally. Say for example, let's just say that a fox fur, for a regular trading, you might just get one axe. But if that French fur trader or British fur trader really needed this fox fur for a particular reason, They might give away this axe and a pot, or this axe, a pot, and a blanket. It all depends on what they needed and the price and demand, supply and demand, just basic economics of what they needed. So it was very much like how we shop and buy things today, but it was very important for cultural reasons as well, which we're going to talk about in the next segment. The fur trade was an exchange of goods. The other thing it was an exchange of culture. So you had groups that hadn't encountered each other, were coming together to do business or to exchange goods and services. And with that were some unintended consequences, or the melding of cultures. So there's a few different ways that these Native groups and European groups and Native American groups were able to overcome barriers and come together to trade furs. So first, probably the most simplest thing is think about language. If you were a French fur trader who came across the Atlantic, you traverse the riverways and then you come here to this region and you come across a native village and you paddle up to it in your canoe and you get out and you approach the village. There's probably one thing you're already thinking. You have no idea the language they're speaking, what they're saying, and those native people, if they've never encountered a European trader before, have no idea how to speak French or how to speak English. So they had to figure out ways to communicate with each other to get their points across. And one of these really great examples we have here is this blanket. So this blanket is actually made by the Hudson Bay Company, and this is kind of their signature style that they would have used in the fur trade. You know, just a basic white wool blanket, and then they had dyed stripes. But the thing I want to point out, I'll hold it here so you can see, is these 4 points right here, these 4 little black marks. This was one of the ways that the traders and the native communities were communicating with each other without having to really say anything. Once traders came into communities and started bringing blankets like this is what, if you were trading for this and if you wanted this is what you would look for. Because there were different markings, because these 4 different markings here indicated a few different things. So think about this as like this blanket's price tag. So different markings indicate how big they were, the quality of the wool, and the overall quality of the entire blanket. And if you were Miami or Potawatomi or any native group, this was a highly desired blanket, because if you think about wool blankets, they'll keep you dry, they'll keep you warm, as opposed to animal furs. So this was one of the ways, just a really simple visual cue that they were using to communicate with each other. So that's how they got through things like language, until eventually, like for example, if you use the French, for example, they started to learn native languages, and the same thing happened for native cultures. They were learning French, and then they'd later learn English as well. So the language barrier started to break down a little bit as time went on, but this was one really simple way. Another way that the cultures mended as the fur trade went on, decades and decades, is the way both groups started to look changed. They were both using and were influenced by each other's style. So when you study paintings or you read some diaries or things like that from the period, you start to see native groups start to adopt kind of European fashion sense. The clothing starts to change, the way they look begins to change. The style of clothing they have starts to change, the fabric, all that thing. And the same thing goes for European traders as well. They were starting to dress a little bit more native and have those native indicators or fashion sense, maybe as a way to look good for the people that they're trying to trade with, maybe just a way to integrate themselves into the native culture. And that's another thing that's really important with a fur trade like this, is we get the melding of these native cultures through, specifically here in our region, what's known as the Métis culture, which is a mixing of the native and French. They would intermarry with each other, they would have kids, and today they produced a whole new cultural group known as the Métis. So they were really living with each other and creating this brand new culture that melded both European and native together. And that's another thing that we want to talk about too, is especially early on in the French fur trade period, when the French were here, in the early parts of the fur trading in our region is there was a built reliance among both these cultural groups. The French, for example, coming here to a new environment, had no idea anything about the landscape, the wildlife, even things like what kind of berries to eat or things like that. And they learned that from the native groups that lived here. They learned what to eat so you wouldn't get sick, or how to trap, or how to live, and how to make sure you survive. And then in turn, the native groups started to rely more and more on Europeans and the goods that they were really bringing with them. So that has an impact, good and bad, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But think of it like this. Take one really good example, which is tool making. The native groups were making their own tools, whether it was points or whether it was cooking vessels or things that they used to farm with, all those different types of things. They were all making before the Europeans arrived. The fur trade happens. The Europeans are now giving them things like metal pots or clay pots that they're using to cook with. They're using things like new farming tools made out of metal. And as time went on, as the generations passed, the skills of making their own tools started to go away, because it makes perfect sense. Why would you need to learn how to make tools when you could just get them? Think about it today, like with our cell phones. How many of you can know exactly the phone numbers of like 5 people in your phone? Probably not. Or things like the telegraph. No one knows how to use a telegraph machine now because we don't have to know how to do that. So it was just something that the skills started to kind of fade away as they started to rely more on European goods. So we see a really big intermingling of cultures, all because of this fur trade. And the intermingling of that culture and the fur trade over years and years started to have a number of impacts, good and bad. So what we're going to talk about in the next segment is all those different types of impacts, whether they are good or whether they were bad. And as we study them in history, what does it mean for us today? So let's go ahead and talk about those impacts. Things that's really important about this fur trade, even as we look at it now, over almost 200 years later, was the impact that it had. Whether it was good, whether it was bad, there are a number of things, and we could really dedicate hours and hours in talking about all the impacts of the fur trade, but I wanted to talk about specifically 3 different impacts. First, let's talk about what happened to the wildlife and the natural environment here. So as you can see here, I have a couple different furs around me. We have a deer fur here, we have a beaver fur, and then here's another beaver fur. It's tiny. Now, if you were just looking at all 3 of these furs and I were to tell you which one would be the most valuable, most people would say the deer fur because it's the biggest. And you'd be wrong. These beaver furs became very desirable. So much so that this led to overhunting and overhunting and overhunting by native groups, because the Europeans demanded these furs in high numbers. Because when they would be sent back to Europe and turned into things like felt or hats or pieces of clothing, they would be able to be sold at a really high price. So the demand for beaver furs went through the roof. And native groups had to fight and fight and fight and hunt to find these. So much so that it almost led to the extinction of beavers here in North America. Even that, as native groups started to keep looking for more and more beaver populations, they started to, for example, the native groups that lived in the eastern part of what becomes the United States started to move west to look for more beaver populations. So much so that it caused what's known as the Beaver War during the 1600s. And that had an impact here in the native groups that were living in our communities. Because as these groups moved into these hunting areas and into other territory of these native groups, the Miami and the Potawatomi that were living here, they would fight for these hunting grounds and hunting territories. So much so that it caused a refugee crisis here. Miami and Potawatomi that were living here in our area were forced to flee lands that they lived on for generations and go up the northern tip of Lake Michigan, around Lake Michigan, up north into what is today Green Bay, Wisconsin. And the Miami and the Potawatomi spent over 20 years there seeking refuge until the beaver wars were over and the native groups, backed by European military as well, were pushed back further east to the lands that they were occupying prior to that. So that's one big impact. this fur trade caused a almost extinction of a species of wildlife, and it caused wars here in the United States, or what becomes the United States, even that might have never happened, all because of the desire for the Europeans for furs here from North America. The other thing that was a consequence, especially as different native groups enter our area, first there was the French, later in the mid-1700s we have the British occupying this area, is exploitation during the trade. Because think about this, what would happen if your trading partner no longer wants to trade certain goods with you? What do? Especially if those goods that you get from that group, you need to survive. So for example, when the British came to this area and they took over after the French and Indian War in the mid-1700s, when they were trading with the native groups in our area, the British decided to restrict trading on firearms and bullets. So imagine you were using guns and bullets to hunt with, to defend yourself, all these different other things that you might need it for, and you're no longer able to get that. Like say for example, you go to the grocery store, and the people that work in the grocery store tell you what you can buy, and certain things that you use every day, like take bread for example. They are no longer willing to give you bread. They have a bunch of bread, but they're not willing to give it to you anymore. So what does that mean for you? How do you have to do that to survive? So they restricted certain goods, which really caused a lot of conflict here in the area. And we see, as we study history, a lot of native groups coming together and leading uprisings during this time of British occupation. And there's kind of one other really long impact, if we look, that had its roots in the fur trade. And one thing I'm referring to is the loss of native languages. So as you think about it, we talked about it earlier, how both these groups had to learn each other's languages, whether it's French or English, and the French and English had to learn native languages. But as time went on, different cultural groups from European countries and later the United States forced or dictated that these native groups learn English. And then slowly as time went on in history, the speaking of native languages amongst both groups, whether it be native or European or Native and American, started to fade away as the Americans and the Europeans started just basically dictating that the native groups learn English. We start to see a loss of language because it's not getting used as much. So if we were to push this forward in time from the fur trade to, let's say, 1830, when Elkhart County becomes a county here in Indiana, the native groups here may have been speaking their native languages, but soon they would all have to kind of convert to starting to speak English on a regular basis. And as we go forward into the 1800s and the 1900s, those languages are spoken less and less and less, till almost they completely disappear, and that there are no native language speakers. Thankfully though, through the work of really hard-working professors and people of native origin, that they've been able to do research and look at a number of sources, and they are able to keep their native language going till today. A lot of native groups, like the Miami and Potawatomi that live in our area today in Indiana, are not only speaking this language, but they're beginning to teach it to anyone who wants to learn it, whether it's people that belong to those specific communities and the specific Miami and Potawatomi communities, or they're teaching it to people who are just interested in wanting to learn a different language. They've been able to recover the language, so now that language and that tradition and that very important part of their culture has recovered and is still able to survive and thrive in the communities today. But that all could have gone away, all because of something that started during this fur trade. So when we look at the fur trade, it's kind of a mix. There are a lot of things that changed. Some people say those are good, some people say those were bad. That's the good thing about history, is that it's always a discussion. So hopefully you learned something about why the fur trade was important for all the different types of communities and how it changed cultures. So we hope you enjoyed this video. Hopefully you learned a little bit about Elkhart County history, and we'll see you next time.